Good morning, everybody. So I'm back up at the podium again. Who remembers who was here last time I spoke or taught? A few hands in the room. Okay, what did I speak about last time? Does anybody remember? Joy. Okay, good. So my father emailed me this week and said, "Hey, do you want to teach on Sunday?" And actually, I've been kind of working on something, but it wasn't really quite ready yet. So I guess I'm going to ask you guys to kind of bear with me because it wasn't really, I didn't put all the kind of finishing touches. I didn't really polish it up as much as I wanted to, but I still think it's presentable. So we'll take it from there. And JJ said to me, she goes, "What's the name of the teaching?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. I don't really have a name for it." So she said, "Well, give me something, that I can put in the church announcement email." I said, "Okay." So I said, "I guess you would call it, how do we get to that next step in our relationship with God?" And that's just something that's been kind of in my heart a lot lately, which is what happens when we feel like we've been kind of stuck in the same gear for a long time? Or my father's been talking a lot lately about the idea that, there's a relationship with God, and then there's going to church and having a religion. There's a difference between the two. So how do we have a relationship with God, or how do we take that next step in our relationship with God? And what is a relationship with God? And then I thought about it. I'm like, well, relationships kind of get deeper over time. Like, I know Jody a lot better now than I did when we were dating. Right, Jody? So relationships get deeper, and they grow, and they move, and they go to the next step. But sometimes when we're walking with God, sometimes just like any relationship, sometimes we get stuck in that same gear. And what happens when you're stuck in the same gear? Anybody drive stick shift ever? Okay, what happens when you're pressing the gas but you're not changing gears? Car starts to kind of sputter and do some weird stuff, right? And that's what happens with us, actually. When we stay where we are with God, we're not pressing further into a relationship with God. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to use a couple different examples of how we can take the next step. But maybe about a year or so ago, my older sister Corey, some of you may or may not know her, she guest spoke at this fellowship, and she said God gave me a prophetic word for this fellowship, and that is that I'm preparing Family of Hope for glory. And you guys are going to see glory and feel glory and the glory of God. And I'm kind of contemplating that a year later, and I'm saying to myself, do we really believe that? Do we really think that God is preparing this fellowship or the greater fellowship in the Hudson Valley or in the country? Do we really feel like God's preparing us for glory? And that's kind of a convicting question, because I thought to myself, I'm like, I don't know if I feel that all the time. I don't know if I always feel like God's preparing me for glory or for something glorious or for something new and something powerful in my life. I kind of feel like I'll go to work and I do my thing, but I don't always feel like I'm being prepared in my heart for something glorious in the Spirit. So I think we have to really kind of search ourselves a little bit and really ask, are we really ready for that? Are we ready to take a next step? Are we ready to be prepared? Are we ready to actually do what it takes to grow deeper in God? And I always say to myself all the time, okay, well, I really gotta do something more at the church. I do the worship thing. I do this. I gotta do that. I gotta figure out some type of thing that's mine that I do, and that'll make me feel stronger about God and blah blah blah. But works are really 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 great, and God asks us to do works, but it has to be in our heart. We can't just do works and expect that all of a sudden we're going to grow. We have to, in our heart, feel like, okay, God's asking me to do something. Now I'm going to walk it out. And it's hard to get there because a lot of that is trusting God. So here's what I'm going to present to you guys today. I want to look at a certain Bible story, which is a very famous Bible story, and I want to kind of break it down a little bit, and then I want to give you guys some examples of people that I think live out trusting God and walking with God, and then we'll try to answer that question, which is, how do we get to the next step? All right, you guys following me? Okay. So Nate, could you bring up, it's Matthew 14, I think it's verse 20. It's the story of Jesus walking on water. If you guys want to turn your Bibles or Bible apps to Matthew chapter 14. I actually read online yesterday that the Bible app has been downloaded over 365 million times from this one place. 365 million versions of the Bible app have been downloaded, which I think is pretty cool. Okay. It's up. Okay, good. It's Matthew chapter 14, please. And then it's verse 20, I think. Okay. So while Nate's bringing that up, I was a history major in college, so I have a degree in history. So one of the things I do when I'm reading the Bible is I always try to get some type of historical perspective. And I just have to, So according to the Jewish customs in the Jewish society and the traditions, the prophets of Judaism were really, really, really highly regarded. Okay, so I'm talking about like the books of Isaiah and Jeremiah. These are the prophets in Jewish times. And these men were really, really highly regarded. In fact, you could almost compare them to like the founding fathers of the U.S. Okay, like we have you don't mess with George Washington, right? You can't really disagree with Thomas Jefferson, or else we'd call you like a communist or something. So we have like our founding fathers, and we we just agree with that. They kind of built the building blocks of Western civilization, so we don't really challenge their ideas too often. And even more so, the society in before Christ, they even more so revered the words that came from the prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, because those men, they didn't just build the building blocks for government, they actually were considered a direct link to God and what God was trying to tell His people. So the prophets were really, really, really highly regarded. Now here's what's cool. The prophets gave all these prophecies about the coming of the Messiah, and Jesus actually fulfilled over 300 of those prophecies. That's pretty cool, right? So Isaiah said the Messiah is going to come in this, or he's going to be born here, or he's going to come in on a donkey. Jesus fulfilled all of those, and then some. Okay? Now, when Jesus came and He began His ministry, one of the things He started to do was He started to perform a lot of miracles. And when I say He started to perform a lot of miracles, what I'm saying is He actually would go up to people who were born blind and He would give them sight. Or He would go up to men who had leprosy, or men and women who had leprosy, and He would just cure them. And He would do it in all sorts of weird, various ways. There was no set way that He did it. And He would go up, and He performed so many miracles that the Bible actually kind of almost skims over it a little bit. Like, for instance, they say that there was a crowd of 5,000 men, not including women and children. Then it says that they came up to Him, and it says Jesus healed their sick. So out of 5,000 people, there were probably several hundred sick people, and it just says Jesus healed all their sick. So He just performed hundreds and thousands of miracles. He's just constantly performing miracles, and that was part of His ministry. Okay? Side note, if you study religion, or you study other religions, you'll realize that there's really no other religion that has a central focal point or a figure that actually performed real physical miracles. Muhammad did not perform any miracles. Okay? Joseph Smith didn't perform any miracles. The only person that actually performed physical miracles was Jesus. Okay? Now, as a historian, or I'd like to think I was kind of a historian at one point in my life, we look at that and we say, well, how do we know Jesus actually performed all those miracles? Like, how do we know this? Like, let's test it. Well, one of the things that they teach you in history, or in college-level history, is they say to you, okay, well, how do you know anything occurred in the past? Like, how do we know that the Greek and Roman societies were the way that we think they are? The only way to actually truly know that is writing. So people wrote things down, okay? And that really began the wheels of history, and when people started writing things. And we look at first-hand accounts of events that happened, okay? So the reason why we know about the Greek and Persian wars is because of a historian of that time named Thucydides, and he started writing these things down, okay? Once he wrote it down, we had a first-hand account of what happened. Well, what I want to tell you guys is that if you look into this, there are more first-hand accounts of the miracles that Jesus performed than a lot of the events that we look at and we know are 100% true. Like, we know that the Greeks and the Persians fought, but there's more first-hand accounts written down about the miracles of Jesus than there were of even that event. So we know that Jesus did this. We know that this to be true. Okay? So he performed all these miracles. Now, if a man showed up today in our society and started performing miracles, it'd be kind of a big deal, wouldn't it? Somebody was going up to blind people and healing them. This is a big deal. And society was crazy. People didn't trust him, or they followed him, or it just was like a sword. It just cut through society. Some people hated him. Some people said he's the Messiah. Okay? So what ended up happening was a lot of the masses were looking at Jesus and saying, "You are the Messiah. We want to make you our king. Okay? We want to put you on the throne." They wanted to basically just usher Jesus in to the capital and say, "Here's our king. Put a crown on his head and give him power and let him, be our political king with the Romans and whoever else." Okay? And they would get together and they would shout, "He's our king, he's our king." They wanted to crown him. Now, here's what's really, really cool, and listen to this. This is important. God, through his Son, had a much bigger and much more important plan than just making Jesus king, earthly king, for a very short period of time on earth. See, God's plan was generational, and God looked to the future for the next 1,000 years, 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, I like to think that God saw you guys worshiping today, back then when his Son was born, that he saw this, and he said, once my Son completes his work, for the next 2,000 years, 3,000 years, people are going to be living for God, worshiping me. They're going to know the truth. I don't know if we're in the end times or not. Some people say we are, but the point is that I'm making is maybe 1,000 years from now, people will still be right here in the Hudson Valley worshiping God and giving their hearts to God. And so Jesus, when they said we want to crown you and make you king, make you our political king, he withdrew from that because he knew the big picture. He knew that the plan was so much bigger and better than just being an earthly king right here for this moment. And so the people of that time, even the disciples, they got all caught up in like, okay, all right, we're gonna usher in a new king. He's the Messiah. We're gonna do this. We're gonna crown him. Maybe we'll even challenge the Roman power. This is what they're thinking, right? But Jesus is thinking so much bigger and so much better. Okay, so keep that in the back of your minds here as I'm moving forward. Okay? Let me go to my notes. So Jesus withdrew from this crowd when they started shouting that they're going to make him his king. And Jesus withdraws, and later on, he's praying up on a mountainside, and he tells his disciples, go get into a boat and come meet me later. Okay? So, Nate, I want to go to that Bible verse. Can you just keep going? Go to the next part. All right, maybe go back a little bit. I'm sorry. Okay, so Matthew 14:22. So he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, and then he sent the crowds away because the crowds are really fanatical, and they love Jesus. He's been healing them. They want to make him king. And he went up the mountain to pray by himself, and then it was evening, and he was all by himself. So they go to the next part. Okay, now the disciples got into the boat. And they were a pretty long distance from land, a couple miles. And then a storm came, and they started getting hit by some waves. Okay? And then it says, and the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it is a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Okay? So I'm going to stop right there. So I made a couple notes about what happened here. Jesus said to the disciples, go get into the boat. Okay? A storm came. Jesus actually walked on water towards the disciples in the boat. They thought it was a ghost. They didn't know what it was. And one of the first things he says to them is, don't be afraid. Okay? Now I'm going to keep going here a little bit. Peter said to him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. and then Jesus said, "Come." Okay? So here's what we have happening here. Jesus walks to them on water. They thought it was a ghost. He says, "Don't be afraid." And then he tells Peter, "Come." Now, I'm going to change gears here a little bit. The Apostle Paul describes how the church should be structured. So the Apostle Paul says in the New Testament that Jesus is the king and the Godhead and the leader of all of the church. Okay? So we have pastors and elders in this church, but the true leader of this church is Jesus himself. Okay? Now, in the church you have disciples and followers of Jesus. Okay? So I like to think that just like 2,000 years ago, I like to think that we're like the disciples of Jesus. Okay? So we're his followers. Okay? So I'm going to make an analogy here. If you're here today and you're following Jesus, or you're kind of on the right path, you're like the disciples. Jesus said, "All right, go get into the boat." You're getting in the boat. Okay? You're coming to church on Sundays. You're getting in the boat. You're like, "Okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to get in the boat today. God, I'm pretty sure this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm going to do it." The disciples were the same way. They got, "Okay, Jesus is telling us to go in the boat. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to us. We want to make him king, but he's telling us to go get in the boat, so we're going to go get in the boat." Okay? So when we're in the boat, we're kind of comfortable, right? We come to church, we do the things that we think we should do or that are morally right, and we're comfortable here in this position, but then all of a sudden something will happen and make us uncomfortable. So the waves came, and they started rocking the boat, and the disciples were we don't know what's going on. And that happens to us. We have weird things that happen in life, uncomfortable things, maybe traumatic things that make us uncomfortable. They make us question whether we should have even gotten into the boat, right? Should I even be going to church? Maybe I'm going to start questioning all of this, okay? And then we're there, and Jesus shows up, and he's walking on water. So here's what I think is cool about that. He's actually performing something that's physically impossible. He's performing a miracle here, okay? And God does that in our lives all the time. There's if you research it, there's miracles that are taking place all over the world. Okay, there's ministries in all different types of countries, and there are literally physical miracles that are taking place. People are being healed. Patty, I remember you told me a couple stories about in India. They said people were being healed. So this is actually happening. Okay, so we see it. But if Jesus walked on water towards us, we'd still be like, "What is that? Is that a ghost?" We would still have that reaction, just like the disciples did. Okay? Now here's what I think is really, really neat. We're in the boat, but God says to us, "Come. Don't be afraid." Okay? He says to Peter, "Don't be afraid. Come." Now, how many of us would actually get out of the boat and really trust God that we could walk on water? I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. How many of us would actually trust God in that moment? I don't see anybody raising their hand. That's scary. So, but that's natural because it's hard for us. It's hard for us to be able to trust accomplishing something that breaks the laws of physics. Okay. But I want you to consider this for a second here. When God asks you or me or all of us to do something that seems impossible, how many of us actually really trust God that he can make it work? I know that's convicting. It's hard to consider that, but how many of us really truly believe that God's going to be able to make it work if he's asking us to do something that we don't know if we can do? Okay? So here's my message for you today. Get ready to start trusting God in the most insane ways. Okay? So to answer the question I posed in the beginning, how do we take that next step with God? We're going to have to start trusting God in ways that we haven't trusted God before. Okay? And let's really look at ourselves. Let's really consider how much we actually trust God. Because if we don't trust God, guess what? We're really not going to take that next step. We're not going to grow, and we're not going to get deeper. We're not going to learn things. We're not going to see profound things if we don't really actually trust God when he tells us to do something that's going to work out. Do we trust him enough to step out into the water? Do we trust him enough to tithe, to give, to go to the meetings when we're tired, to pray when we don't feel like it? All right? Now, I'm going I actually didn't tell my sister I was going to do this, but I'm going to embarrass her a little bit. So JJ. Now, JJ's not perfect, but let me tell you a quality about JJ that nobody can take away from her. She's a great singer. That's good. I wasn't going to say that, Kurt, but good point. Here's a quality about JJ that you can't take away from her. JJ really loves God. Okay? And if you ever talk to JJ about God, you'll find out pretty quick that she really loves God, and she trusts God. She trusts God enough that you went to Egypt, right? Okay. And JJ actually, in Egypt, she was doing missionary work. JJ actually spent time in a dumpster working with children who lived in the dump. That's where they lived. She spent time with them, and she helped them, and she ministered to them. Then you spent time in New Zealand, in Australia, right, where you spent time with the Aborigines. So JJ actually was a missionary, and she trusted God. Now she's going to Kenya in February, right? JJ's going to go to Kenya, and I've had conversations with her about it. And you can tell she's very, very concerned about, the welfare of her children. She's going to be gone. Her children are going to be here. She's going to be a different continent. She's worried about the welfare of her children. But, see, the cool thing about my sister is that if God says to her, JJ, I want you to go to Kenya because I have something for you and I want to show you something and I want you to go help my people, JJ says, okay, you know what? I'm worried about my kids. I'm worried about my husband. I'm worried about the finances. I'm worried about all this stuff. Who's going to pay the bills and who's going to do this and how, who's going to clean the house while I'm gone and am I going to be safe? Could I get Ebola or all these things? She just trusts God, right? So she just steps out and says, okay, I'm going to go to Kenya. I'm not asking anybody for any financial help or anything. I'm just going to go because God asked me to go. So I just trust God that I'm just going to go. Okay? And here's what's amazing to me about trusting God, because a lot of times we'll say, okay, like, all right, well, I'm gonna if God wants me to, to kind of go do some missionary work, I'll let God will tell me when it's the right time. Or, if I'm supposed to be part of that ministry that my pastor's been asking me to get involved with, I'll pray about it, and if God tells me to do it, I'll do it. But I read a book one time, and the author of the book said, what's amazing is that we don't need God to tell us to watch TV or to play sports or video games or to entertain ourselves, but when it comes to actually doing His work, we need Him to directly tell us. Isn't that amazing that we do that? We rationalize it. We're like, oh, I'll put in the work and I'll show up to the church on Tuesday project night and I'll help out. If God tells me to do it, I'll do it. But I don't need God to tell me, to watch the next episode of The Blacklist. I just do it. Isn't that incredible how we rationalize that? So, anyway, I'm gonna read you guys two quick little stories here of people who can successfully answer the question, how do we get to the next step with God? And how do we learn to trust God? Okay? Am I okay on time? Okay. So here's a quick story about a man named Simpson. Simpson was given his English name when he arrived at a missionary-run orphanage around the age of 4. His parents had not yet named him, which happens often among the younger children of poverty-stricken, lower-caste families in India. Okay? Simpson's mother was married as a child bride at the age of 13, a practice still commonly found in Indian villages. Simpson was her 6th child, and the woman in the village gave her herbs to try to end her pregnancy so that she wouldn't have to stop working and have to feed another child. But the herbs didn't work. So Simpson was born, and Simpson always believed that God had a special, God had His hand in Simpson's life, okay? And because of it, Simpson splits his time between an orphanage that he started and an evangelism ministry that brings God's words to illiterate villagers through audio Bibles. Isn't that cool? So he was recently asked, how do you live and where do you get your salary? And he answered in the most simple and humble manner, I live by faith. I don't have a family or a wife, so what do I need a salary for? And he says that he would rather have money go to supporting another program to help people or expose more people to the Word of God. Simpson says that by living this way, he has to trust God. Okay, remember the word trust. He has to trust God that His hand on his life will keep taking care of him. And he's dependent on God in the prayers of others. It's pretty neat, right? Let me read you one other person here. This is a woman named Jamie Lang. When Jamie was 23 years old, she flew from the U.S. to Tanzania with $2,000 out of her savings account. She planned to stay until she ran out of money, at which point she would come home. Jamie was overwhelmed by all of the need that she encountered, so she started praying that God would allow her to make a radical difference. After about 6 months, she met an 8-year-old girl at church who was carrying a baby on her back. Jamie learned that the baby's mother was dying from AIDS and that she was too weak to care for him. Jamie began to buy formula for the little boy, Junio, to provide him with nutrition. He was half the size of a healthy baby. Jamie fell in love with Junio, and she wondered if she was being foolish, a 24-year-old single girl adopting a child. She didn't even know if Tanzania allowed international adoptions, but eventually she discovered that the country would allow her to adopt if she had lived there for 6 months. Isn't it funny how in the story, after 6 months of trusting God, all of a sudden she meets this child? Before Junio's mother died of AIDS, she came to Jamie and said, "I have heard how you were taking care of my son, and I have never known such a love. I want to be saved." And just before she died, she said, "I know that my son is taken care of, and I will see him in heaven someday." Jamie spent 6 months going through the adoption process and then 5 more months working with the American Embassy to get Junio here. When she finally came home, she had been gone for a year and a half. Junio is now 5, totally healthy, and HIV negative. Since adopting Junio, Jamie has gotten married, had a little girl, and is moving back to Tanzania with her family to work with Wycliffe to translate the Bible for a group that has never heard it before. Now, why am I telling you these stories? I'm telling you these stories because these people 100% completely trust God. And they trust that the Bible, that every word of it, that it's true. And that when Jesus says, "Trust me, I have a plan for you, I'm going to bless you, I want you to prosper," they actually believe that that's true. I have such a hard time trusting God in my life, and then I read stories like that, and I'm like, I am so selfish and stupid. Right? You can't help but feel like that sometimes. Are we really ready to really trust God in our lives? And when Jesus says, "Come, step out of the boat, get onto the water," do we really believe God? Are we ready to actually trust Him? I'm not saying that God's going to send you as a missionary to some other country, but I'm just saying that when God says to you, "Hey, go to that meeting because I'm going to bless you and I have a word for you tonight," are we going to do it and trust God that He's going to bless us when we go to that meeting? Or when God says, "I want you to help out with the church and I want you to maybe do a project and help work on, get your hands dirty and work on something," are we really going to trust God that it's going to bless us, it's going to be worth our time? Okay? You see, I'm going to go back now. I'm going to go back to the Jewish society who they wanted to make Jesus their political king. You see, what we do is we try to, just like they did, we try to make God fit our world. Okay? And so they saw Jesus, they saw miracles. Okay, cool. You're the new king, and you're you're the political king here, and we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that. And instead, God's like, no, you don't get it. I'm bigger than you guys. I'm bigger than this. I'm bigger than just being crowned king for the next 20, 30 years. I got a big plan. My plan goes for thousands of years. My plan is going to end in a new earth. In the book of Revelation, it says that God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. My plan is bigger than what you think. So we have to stop trying to take God and trying to pigeonhole Him into our little world and making Him fit. We just have to trust God that what the Bible says is true. We just have to trust Him. And that's hard because it's scary, it's unexpected, and it requires us doing things that we don't know if we can do. Maybe even breaking the law of physics, right? Like Peter. So, I'm actually done, but let me just leave you guys with this. If you feel like in your heart like you really know in your heart that you need to start trusting God more, talk to somebody about it, because that happens to all of us. I do it every day, and I think to myself, I'm not really, I feel it in my heart that I'm supposed to do X, but I haven't really done it yet, and I keep putting it off. I'm like, oh, I'll get to it. We have to stop doing that. We just have to trust God. And when He says, I want you to do this, do it. And we all have a calling, we have a plan, we have a purpose. Let's stop procrastinating. Let's just do it. Okay? If God says to you, I want you to go to Kenya, you know what? JJ's going to come back from Kenya, and you might get a stirring in your heart that says, you know what? I think God wants me to go there too. Be open to it. Start trusting what God has for you. And that's it. That's all I have.